Hello, Hanover Presbyterian. You all know that we have been blessed by the history, knowledge, and writings of Josh Butler. And Josh has written something to encourage us during this incredible time in our history. Please listen and ask God to help you remain faithful to Him and be used for His glory during this time. It's called A Tale of Two Plagues. It is probably not much comfort for any of us to hear that pandemics, plagues, and pestilence are nothing new and have been with us for a long time. And knowing it does very little to make the current times much easier or less troubling. But knowing that God is in charge of things does comfort, and it always makes things easier. Now, part of being a Christian is accepting that both the good and bad things of the world are under God's direction, even viruses. Still, though, there is a lot of space between accepting and understanding. Perhaps some examples of how God has used pestilence and disease in the past to His purpose might help us to understand a bit closer how God sometimes goes about things. In the year 166 AD, the Roman Empire was at its height. It ruled the known world and was strong. Prosperity and wealth were common, and times were good, not just for those on top, but for everyone. Most people had very little reason to pay much attention to the strange new, what they called a cult, that was floating around the empire involving a man on a cross. They called themselves Christians, and most ordinary people only knew two things about them: that Nero had blamed them for the burning of Rome, and that they might practice cannibalism, because as part of their worship, it was said they drank the blood and ate the flesh of Jesus, the man they followed. The old gods seemed to be enough for most people. Besides, the old gods didn't ask very much of you. A couple minor sacrifices now and then, and you could go about your business. Again, times were good. And then the plague hit. And it would last almost 20 years. We can't be sure, but it was likely a form of smallpox, and it devastated the empire. Without dwelling on the details, pretty much all building stopped. Commerce stopped. Trade stopped. The army almost disintegrated, and the death rate among adults was devastating. In the midst of so much trouble, people quite naturally turned to their gods for help. But all the prayers didn't amount to much. Diana, Jupiter, Neptune, Apollo, and Minerva didn't answer, and the plague raged on. Some few men, feeling abandoned by the old gods, began to turn to the Christians, who seemed to be at peace. They thought that if their gods could do nothing about the plague, then perhaps this Jesus, the Christian God, could, and Christianity began to grow. Eventually, the plague would end, and by the end of it, the church could no longer be ignored because there were so many new Christians. With faith in the old gods shaken so badly, the comfort of the cross and the risen Christ shone through. Still, though, man has never changed, and as good times returned and the plague faded, many turned back to the old gods. Emperors, seeing in the Christian church a possible threat to their power, began to persecute Christians. They blamed them for all kinds of things, and almost every new difficulty, disaster, or problem was said to be caused by the Christians and their strange Jesus. Still, the church grew. The truth is like that, growing no matter what is done to stop it. So the persecution got worse until the year 249. That was the year of our second plague. This time it wasn't smallpox, but most likely a strain of influenza. And it too devastated the empire and almost brought it to its knees. The emperor's response was to blame the plague on the Christians. He told the people that the Roman gods were punishing the people for not destroying the Christians, and that once they were done away with, then the disease would end. But it didn't end. It got worse, and people began to flee. And then much of the empire noticed something both troubling and beautiful. As men fled the pandemic, it was noticed that most of the hospitals were being run by the despised Christians. Most of those comforting the sick and dying were the hated Christians. And those looking after the new widows and orphans were once again those awful Christians. The people saw this, and the church continued to grow faster than ever. We don't know how God will use our current troubles, but we can be sure that He will use it, and that He will use it for good. All we have to do is continue to live as He would have us, and to do what He has commanded us. God will make sure that others see and hopefully believe.